Hey guys, CrossFlux here with another review. This time I'm covering the sequel to Teslagrad, World to the West. As many of you may know, Teslagrad is one of my favorite games ever, so the sequel has a lot to live up to. Does it hold its own? Stay tuned to find out. As with all of my reviews, there will be spoilers. I always try to keep these videos as spoiler-free as possible, but it's so hard to give the game a fair shot without going into at least some detail. Consider this your warning. World to the West was developed by Ring Games and published by Soedesco. It's a 3D top-down action-adventure game that is somewhat reminiscent of 2D Zelda games. This is quite a departure from the kind of game that Teslagrad was. And personally, I don't feel this kind of game is what Ring Games is best at making. I know I'm jumping the gun a little bit when it comes to my overall feelings on this game. There's definitely a lot of ideas here. I just don't feel like many of them were fleshed out enough. I think this game could have used some more time in the oven, if you know what I mean. I also think that Ring Games could really make a killer game in this same style if they were given another chance to do so, assuming they learned from their mistakes with World to the West. The bulk of the game is split into various sections, as there are 4 protagonists to play as, each with their own stories and motivations. Metroidvania elements are present, with some early areas of the map being blocked off by not having the right character or upgrade, as well as light platforming segments. The bulk of the gameplay consists of puzzle solving and combat. I usually start with the narrative in these types of videos, so why change now? What I find really neat about this game is the 4 different character concept. When there are a lot of moving pieces to a story, seeing that same story from multiple perspectives can help the player understand all the intricacies under the hood. Unfortunately, this idea immediately falls flat, in my opinion. See, the actual story of this game is very bland and by the books. It doesn't benefit from being seen from multiple points of view. If anything, it makes the story even clunkier and more drawn out than it already was. A rich businessman uncovers an ancient technology on the newly discovered World to the West. This tycoon, named... Tycoon... Wow, that silent H was a real game changer there. Plans on using its power to blackmail the world into paying him lots of money. This ancient technology is a weather machine of some sort. So Tycoon's goal is to control how well crops can grow all over the entire planet. So if people want to eat, they must pay him an exorbitant amount of moolah. Not only that, but he could threaten a whole region with a terrible natural disaster like a flood or a devastating storm if someone tried to oppose him. Technically, this story is more epic than in Teslagrad. There are larger stakes. This kind of works when you factor in the 4 separate protagonists thing. See, it's hard enough to really flesh out one character and make them memorable in a short game like this. But there's not really a lot of time to do this properly when there are 4 people to do this with. As a result, Ring Games really needed to put the bulk of their narrative on the story rather than the characters. And this is where it falls apart. The story is just so by the numbers. I'm not saying the story is bad per se, it's just incredibly straightforward. There are no winding twists and turns, no gasp moments that really make you think or feel something significant. It's literally, hey, there's a bad guy. Hey, he betrayed you because of course he would, he's a bad guy. And hey, he has a super weapon. Let's stop that. This is what I mean when I said earlier that the story needs to be intricate if you're going to split it up into 4 different ways. Each character's story should reveal something different about what's going on. The way it is now, the same bland story that could have easily been told over the course of 2 hours instead takes 4 times as long, because you have to get each character up to the next plot point before any real progression is made. I think I've covered the story fairly well, so let's move on to the individual characters, the part of the narrative that can really make the story pop and give it context. The first character that we're introduced to is Lumina the Teslamancer. She's one of the daughters of Tesla Kid, the main protagonist from Teslagrad. She begins the game following her father into the rebuilt Tesla Tower. Here she tries to prevent her younger siblings from messing with a transporter device and ends up accidentally warping herself all the way over to the world in the West. Her goal is simply to get home. Along the way, she encounters a young woman named Anastasia, who holds a lot of hatred towards the Teslamancers. Speaking of her, she's kind of a plot point that ends up going nowhere. She's built up in Lumina's story to be some important baddie who may have some personal connection to Lumina in some way, but we never actually learn anything about her, and she just stops showing up in the story at some point. I think Rain Games plans on bringing her back in a future installment. If so, that would justify her existence a bit more, but looking at World to the West as its own game, it just feels empty to include her the way she is. Lumina is probably my favorite of the 4 protagonists, but that's still not really saying much. And I admit I primarily enjoy her because of her aesthetic and background as a Teslamancer. I don't really get a good feel of her personality in this game. She's a little snarky and intelligent, but we don't really know her likes and dislikes. She also doesn't have much interaction with the other characters. The most we get in this department is her feud with Miss Terry and her doting over Knaus. Ironically, I have a better understanding of what Tesla Kid is like, and he never speaks a single word of dialogue. The next character we're introduced to is Knaus, a small boy from Motorland. He's well, how do I describe him? I got it. He's a very brave boy.
Very brave boy.
Very brave boy.
Is how you say
Very
it.
brave boy.
Very brave boy.
Very brave boy. He's essentially a slave and is being used as child labor by the aforementioned tycoon. I believe Knaus and his peers are excavating the weather machine. After hearing a voice tell him that he's not on the moon like he was being told, he escapes and meets up with some of the other characters. What I like about Knaus and his story is that he has some sort of personal stake in stopping Tycoon. I mean, there's no telling how much of his childhood that he's lost at the greedy hands of Tycoon, so he would probably want some revenge. He also cares about his fellow peers who are still enslaved. The problem with his story's execution is that he's sort of just there throughout the whole story. Despite meeting out with Miss Tannock, Lumina, Miss Terry, and Lord Clonington, no one ever bothers to help him or even watch over him. I mean, he may be a very brave boy, but he's still a young child. Yet everyone and their mothers are perfectly content with letting him explore this entire region all by himself. And in fact, Knaus is often the one character that needs to explore a completely alternate path when compared to the other characters to get to where the next meetup spot is. Up next is the mercenary from Mesmer, Miss Terry. She hails from the land of psychics and mental prowess, so you'd think she'd be smarter than even Lumina. But no, she gets easily manipulated by Tycoon. She's also a bit like a treasure hunter and somewhat reminds me of Lara Croft a bit. You get the sense that she's very experienced and that she should be more than capable of handling herself, but she often needs to rely on the other characters in this game or even enemies in order to get by. She's probably my least favorite of the main cast because I just don't find her intriguing as a person. Again, coming from the region of charismatic leaders, mind power, and master manipulators, you'd think she'd at least have a little bit of intrigue to her character. And in this corner, we have the one, the only, Lord Clonington! Actually, he's just one of the many different clones of some rich noble from Angloria. Although Miss Terry is selfish and cares only for herself, Lord Clonington is completely self-centered. He hardly even recognizes that anyone else is around him and only cares about others in the sense that if no one else existed, then there'd be no one to admire him. He's also a complete dunce, but makes up for it with brute strength and a hardy constitution. He easily has the most personality of any of the characters, and is one of my favorites of the main cast. Clonington also has the most shallow reasoning for stopping Tycoon. You see, he just wants fame and even greater fortune. If Tycoon succeeds in his plans, then Lord Clonington will be overlooked by the world. The old blue lady, Miss Tannock, who serves as the party's glue and mentor, is boring and mysterious on the surface. She becomes more interesting if you bother to collect all of the optional backstory scrolls, though. It's indirectly her fault for Tycoon's plan, and she's trying to correct her mistakes by uniting the 4 main characters and helping them to overcome their obstacles. Tycoon is a boring, one-note villain. He's a greedy businessman who's willing to do whatever it takes to strong-arm the entire world into obeying him. There's nothing else to him. His personality is evil? We don't learn about his motivations or his backstory. Why does he want so much power? Was he abused as a child, so he wants enough power so that no one else could ever mistreat him again? Did he grow up rich, so he believes that everything he sees is his, and that it's his birthright to own the world? I'll take anything, really, but instead we get nothing. Gameplay in World to the West is radically different from its predecessor. It is remarkably reminiscent of 2D Zelda games like A Link to the Past. The bulk of the gameplay is exploration through an overworld and an underworld, with fairly simple combat to spice things up a bit. There are the occasional boss fights, which usually test you on the recent ability that you've obtained. Feeling the Zelda vibes yet? This is a solid foundation. I mean, A Link to the Past is a tried and true game that has stood the test of time. Honestly, World to the West feels a bit too similar in my opinion. I feel they should have used A Link to the Past as framework only. Instead of expanding on the ideas used in that game and possibly surpassing the classic, World to the West plays things too safe and feels a bit stale because of it. Having 4 different characters should have allowed for a greater variety of tasks and challenges, but honestly, everyone plays pretty similarly. Everyone has a basic attack that can be spammed effectively to handle various threats. Each character has a technique that assists in traversing the landscape. Lumina has her blink boots, Terry can possess a multitude of creatures, each with their own ways of traversing the field. Knaus can dig under the ground and has ice skates, and Clonington has his bull rush. You could swap between each of these characters at totems, in a similar fashion to the swap barrels from DK64. Each of the creatures suffer from the same problems as the main heroes. They are all the same enemy that has been copy and pasted with a slightly different coat of paint. After noticing you, flail monks will hop towards you and deal contact damage. After noticing you, slap squatches will advance towards you and deal contact damage. After noticing you, grooves will advance towards you and deal contact damage. Oh, but at least they don't immediately advance upon you. Sometimes they take their time and try to circle around. Only the really late game enemies feature projectiles of some kind. This reduces your strategies to just use a ranged attack of your own, or get close and strike first, asking questions later. So when you're not fighting monsters or progressing the story, there are a few collectibles to find. The main thing you'll be finding is money. The only thing you really use this for is to buy in-game hints as to where the important collectibles are. On the surface, this may seem pointless because we live in the age of the internet and walkthroughs. Why do you need to buy some in-game hints when you can just look it up? Well, I appreciate it when games are more or less complete on their own without a need for players to look for outside resources. In this case, the money is a decent addition. The 2 major types of collectibles are health upgrades and lore scrolls. It's just like in Teslagrad, where you're not entirely sure what they are. Anyways, these usually require you to go out of your way to obtain them. The health upgrades are pretty useless, in my opinion, because the game is easy already. Not only that, but each health upgrade is designed to be tailor-made for each character. This would work if the character that the upgrade was designed for was the only one who could reach said upgrade, but unfortunately this isn't the case. If Knaus reaches an upgrade that's designed for Clonington, then he simply can't interact with it. I'm sure this is something that was simply overlooked by the developers, but it's also something that could be fixed with an update. Now, the lore tablets are better, because they fill in some of the backstory of the people who are native to this world in the West, without requiring more badly written dialogue. Not only that, but collecting all 36 batteries allows each of the characters to obtain a unique upgrade to one of their abilities. The problem with this is that it's too little too late. There's no post-game challenge or anything that you would need these upgrades for. If you've gotten all the lore stars, then there's nothing left to do. World to the West's presentation puts it at odds with itself. The jump from Teslagrad to this installment came with an increase in budget. This made it possible to jump from 2D to 3D. This increase in scope led to a lack of focus and polish. Where Teslagrad excelled, World to the West fails, again in my opinion. See, Teslagrad was very minimalistic in its storytelling and world building. It was a quiet game, and it gave you time to breathe and soak in Tesla Kid's plight. On the other hand, World to the West has dialogue, and the writing is mediocre. Things that are obvious are constantly spelled out for you. This dialogue is wasted on primarily exposition, rather than something like meaningful interactions between the various characters. I mentioned the jump from 2D to 3D earlier, and somewhat implied that that was a problem. It's not inherently a problem, you see, it's just that Rain Games wasn't as proficient at 3D game design as they were with 2D. A subjective opinion of mine is that their old school, hand-drawn art style does not translate well to 3D. From a more objective observation, there are tons of glitches and bugs. Even at the time of recording, they still haven't fixed a lot of clipping issues and graphical hiccups. Just go and watch my Let's Play this game and you'll see just how often these bugs messed with me. I've sort of hinted at this throughout the review, but I really want to discuss this more now that we're going over the presentation. World to the West doesn't benefit from presenting its story in one cohesive take. What I mean by this is that we have a story that focuses on 4 different characters with 4 different movesets and 4 different goals, but we're playing one game to which we awkwardly swap between these elements. Okay, so I'm going to try to explain this as best I can. I believe that video games are a higher form of art. Not only are they a combination of video and audio, but there's a level of player interaction and input that other art forms don't often ask for. Some of the most thought-provoking experiences that I've gone through were because of video games. With that being said, I believe the narrative of World to the West suffers because of their lack of trust in the player to piece things together for themselves. The way Rain Games presents the story in this game is like eating a giant rack of ribs. You get all there is to the story in one single go, and there's no room for sides or desserts. One suggestion I would make, and I hesitate to suggest this because I really don't like this game, is follow the example of Sonic Adventure. The game itself falls apart completely, but it has great potential. The thing that World to the West should have taken from SA is the way it presents its story. See, Sonic Adventure had a huge sprawling story with many moving pieces. Trying to tell that story all at once would have led to a lot of exposition or retelling certain parts of the story so that the players wouldn't get lost. Instead, Sonic Team had the bright idea to break this up into 6 different pieces. Each of the 6 playable characters have their own stories. These stories will occasionally cross over when the various characters meet up. Sonic's story was the most basic. He goes from area to area, stopping Chaos and trying to keep Eggman from collecting all the Chaos Emeralds. In Knuckles' storyline, we learn more about what Chaos is and why Eggman is using him. Gamma brings up a philosophical idea about sentience of AI and betrayal. You see, it's how each of these pieces come together to form the entire narrative that makes this game a classic, in my opinion. This didn't just make the presentation of the narrative itself better, but also the gameplay. Because you would see the story through the eyes of only one particular character at a time, each of the gameplay sections would be custom tailored to that particular character and gameplay. Things are more refined that way. Now imagine for a moment that World to the West had implemented a story presentation like Sonic Adventure. On the main menu of the game, you would select from Lumina, Terry, Knaus, or Lord Clonington. From that point onward, you would only play as that character. You'd learn different bits and pieces of what's going on from each of their points of view. Lumina might meet up with Miss Tannock and learn about the history of the people of the West and the history of her own people, running into Anastasia occasionally. Terry would more directly confront Tycoon because of his personal betrayal to her. Knaus would remove some of Tycoon's sway by taking out his smaller minions and rescuing his fellow enslaved kids. Clonington might be like Big the Cat and not serve any real purpose to the story, just providing side story content and making the world feel more alive and lived in. Or he could just stumble his way into Tycoon's plot because he's a moron. By telling the story this way, you wouldn't learn everything about what's going on in one single playthrough. You need to play all 4 chapters to get the whole story. This adds replayability. Then, from a gameplay perspective, each character would have a more dynamic moveset and mechanics that would be more focused on the character in particular. There could be certain areas that only Knaus could access, or Lumina, or something like that. Terry could focus on puzzle solving. Knaus would focus on exploration. Clonington would focus on combat. and Lumina could be a good mix of the three. Beating all 4 chapters might unlock a bonus chapter where you play as Tycoon or Anastasia, allowing us to learn a bit more about their motivations. Presenting the game in this way would make it so that you couldn't swap characters on the fly, but that's not really losing anything. The way the game is now, you're basically doing this already anyways. You're more or less playing 4 games at once, and it's easy to get confused and just keep swapping back and forth between various characters until you somehow manage to make progress with someone. Towards the latter portions of the game, everyone has the same goal anyways, so things boil down to, let me get Lumina from point A to point B. Alright, now let's get Knaus from point A to point B. Okay, now you see what I mean? Swapping between characters could be a good mechanic, if it was used to its full potential. There should have been more puzzles or challenges that required multiple characters to progress. Like, Knaus could use his dynamite to blow up a huge rock into smaller pieces that Clonington could bust through. Lumina could activate a switch at a distance that moves a platform so that Terry could further manipulate by using the various wildlife in the area. You know, stuff like that. I've sprinkled my opinions on the graphics of this game throughout my review, but let me take a moment to focus on them. I absolutely love the hand-drawn 2D approach that Teslagrad presents. It's timeless and reminiscent of old-school rubber hose cartoons. Graphics and art are subjective, so this is simply my opinion, but I just don't like the way this art style is being depicted in 3D. It's a very good upscale from 2D to 3D, and I applaud the artist for being able to maintain the same art style in a whole new dimension. It just looks so uncanny to me. What's more objective is the topic of graphical fidelity. Obviously, every game has some bugs and glitches. It's just gonna happen. But good developers mitigate these as much as possible. The point I'm trying to make is that there are too many graphical bugs in this game for me to give it a pass. With as much time as I've put into this game, I'd estimate that about every 10 minutes I'd experience another graphical glitch. I mean, again, look at my Let's Play. Even in the final episode, I was still encountering new glitches. From a sound design standpoint, things are perfectly fine. I don't recall too many issues with the soundtrack or sound effects. There were even less glitches in this department. The only complaint I have is just how forgettable sounds are in this game. I don't remember any of the songs, and none of the item acquisition jingles. One last thing I want to discuss is the user interface of this game. During gameplay, the screen is really clean and neat. There's very little information clogging up the screen. Your HP and money only take up a small portion of each of the corners. The problem that I have with the UI, though, comes from the map. You get used to the layout and how navigating this map works, but it's not immediately intuitive. Swapping between characters and warping to different sections of the map is a little awkward at first. Again, I think controlling only one character at a time would have smoothed over this issue. As it is, I think the character swapping mechanic is handled as well as it could have been. Well folks, I think that just about covers it. I tried to sprinkle positive changes throughout the review this time, rather than saving them all for the end of the video like I did in my Red Rescue Team review. Overall, I was really disappointed with this game. Not only should it have blown Teslagrad out of the water, but it should have been a good game on its own right. There's a lot of heart in this game, and I can tell it was a fairly ambitious title for a small team. Unfortunately, that ambition got in the way. They should have reeled in some of their ideas and kept the game even simpler and focused on making the smaller experience more refined and polished. As it is, it's not a good game. But I struggle to call it a bad game either. It's the most 5 out of 10 game that I feel I have ever played. It's perfectly mediocre. It's got a lot of great ideas that were executed only subparly, and the whole experience is riddled with glitches. I feel like for their next title, Rain Games should go back to what they're best at, 2D platformers. Or really take their time with their next project and use their experiences of working on this game to make a similar game that's vastly improved. I do believe their next title is apparently a social survival game called Mesmer. It looks promising, but it also seems to suffer from overambition as well, and that worries me. That, and we haven't heard any news on the project in over a year. Another bad sign. Anyways, if you've played World to the West, let me know how you felt about it. If you haven't played it, honestly, I can't really recommend it. Certainly not at full price. If you can catch it really on sale, then sure, go for it. Especially if you care about the lore of the world seen in Teslagrad. But for anyone else, just play Zelda. Alright folks, I hope you enjoyed my thoughts, and will stay tuned for my next review. Thanks so much for watching, and have a blessed day.